A woman was asleep on the plane until the captain suddenly shouted, "Is there a fighter pilot on board?" The scared voice of co-pilot James Wilson came through the speakers as the Boeing 747 flew into one of the worst storms ever seen over the North Atlantic. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we have a serious medical emergency. Captain Mitchell is unconscious, and I need help from anyone with combat flying experience." In seat 23C, Kesha Washington slowly opened her eyes. At 34 years old, she had learned to sleep anywhere during her missions, because rest was always short. But the fear in James's voice made her sit up right away. Nearby, businessman Richard Blackwood adjusted his fancy glasses and muttered that no real pilot would be sitting in economy class. He looked at Kesha with doubt. She wore simple jeans, a plain blouse, and her natural hair tied in a ponytail. The plane shook hard in the storm as rain hit the windows like drums. Among the 312 passengers, fear was spreading fast. Children cried, people prayed, and some even typed goodbye messages on their phones. "Please," James begged over the intercom. "Anyone with military flight training, speak up now. We are flying blind in a Category 5 storm, and I can't handle this alone." Kesha looked around at the frightened faces. No one thought she could be the one to help. To them, she looked like just another passenger, a black woman traveling alone. Suddenly, Richard jumped up and shouted toward the cockpit. "My brother-in-law is a private pilot. I've flown with him many times. I can help." A flight attendant rushed over and said, "Sir, we need someone with military training. Civilian training is not enough." "Are you saying I'm not good enough?" Richard said angrily. "I paid $15,000 for first-class seats. I know more than anyone here." At that moment, Kesha stood up calmly. She moved with quiet confidence, unlike the panicked passengers. As she walked toward the cockpit, people watched her with surprise and doubt. "Excuse me," she told the flight attendant in a steady voice. "Colonel Kesha Washington, Air Force, 500 hours flying F-22 Raptors. Expert at navigation in extreme conditions." The whole plane went silent. Richard stared at her, mouth wide open in shock. "You must be joking," Richard muttered. But in Kesha's eyes was a calm strength that made the flight attendant step back. It was the kind of calm only someone who had survived worse storms could have. It hinted at hidden experience and quiet power about to show itself. Richard laughed bitterly as the storm shook the Boeing 747. "Colonel, look, I respect the military, but I won't risk my life on a fantasy. My wife and I paid a fortune for these seats to avoid trouble like this," some passengers whispered nervously. An old woman in first class said loudly, "Is she really qualified? She looks so young." Her words carried doubt and prejudice. Then co-pilot James Wilson appeared at the cabin door. His face was pale with fear. "Please, anyone with military experience, step forward now. Captain Mitchell is having seizures. I've never flown alone in weather like this." His voice cracked on the last word. Richard jumped up again, puffing his chest. "Listen, young man. I've flown in private jets all over Europe. I have more than 200 hours of experience as a passenger in luxury planes. I know the procedures." Kesha stayed quiet for a moment, watching the scene. In the military, she had learned to choose her battles carefully. But when she saw the true fear in James's eyes, something inside her came alive. The same force that had carried her through dangerous missions. "Mr. Wilson," she said calmly, "tell me our current altitude, speed, and weather conditions. We're at 38,000 feet, speed 450 knots, with crosswinds of 120 km/h and gusts up to 160. James answered automatically. He recognized the authority in her voice. Richard laughed cruelly. "Impressive. She memorized some numbers from Wikipedia. That doesn't make her a pilot." Then Kesha did something that stunned the entire plane. Without hesitation, she recited, "Emergency procedure for loss of pressure at cruising altitude. Oxygen masks on immediately. Emergency descent to 10,000 feet. Descent angle not more than 15 degrees to protect the plane. And contact air traffic control with code 7700. Kesha spoke for another 2 minutes, listing procedures that only a trained military pilot could know by memory. When she stopped, the cabin was silent except for the storm outside. James Wilson looked at her with relief and respect. "Ma'am, the cabin is yours." But Richard Blackwood wasn't done. "Wait a minute. Anyone can memorize procedures. I demand to see real proof before I trust my life to someone who doesn't even belong in first class." His words were sharp, and the other passengers looked away, too nervous to challenge him. Kesha felt the familiar sting of unfairness, the same feeling she had faced many times in the military. She remembered when a white colonel once questioned her ability to lead a combat mission, even with the best flight record. She remembered being passed over for a promotion she had earned, and the whispers about her being chosen only because of racial quotas. But she also remembered what made her one of the most decorated pilots of her time: her ability to use doubt as fuel, insults as motivation, and underestimation as her advantage. "Mr. Blackwood," she said calmly, her voice steady enough to send chills through some passengers, "there are three kinds of pilots: those who fly when it's easy, those who fly when it's hard, and those who fly when it's impossible." She stepped toward the cockpit, then paused. "In my career, I've saved 17 aircraft in situations that manuals said were impossible. But what qualifies me today is not medals or hours in the air." At that moment the plane suddenly dropped, throwing passengers into screams. Kesha stayed upright, steady as if she had faced worse turbulence before. "What qualifies me," Kesha continued, "is that I am the only person on this plane who has flown through a war zone with 2 engines out, no navigation system, and missiles being fired at me. And I still brought my whole squadron home." She nodded and walked toward the cockpit. But before passing Richard, she turned once more. "Mr. Blackwood, when we land, and we will, maybe you'll think about how a black woman, who you said didn't belong in first class, saved your life and your family's life." As Kesha disappeared into the cockpit, the passengers went silent. Many began to realize they were witnessing something bigger than a normal air emergency. Richard Blackwood, for the first time in decades, felt something he hadn't felt since childhood: the painful truth of being completely wrong about someone. His prejudice now seemed not only cruel but dangerously foolish. What none of them knew was that Kesha carried not only expert flying skills but also a personal story that would make every insult sound bitterly ironic. A story that, once revealed, would forever change how they understood courage, skill, and the meaning of heroism. Inside the cockpit, the situation was one that would terrify any airline pilot. Captain Mitchell was shaking violently, foam at his mouth, alarms screaming as his body went into seizures. James Wilson sat frozen in fear, his hands shaking on the controls. "First aid! Now!" Kesha commanded, her voice sharp and steady. She checked the captain's vital signs with the care of someone who had treated wounded pilots in battle. "We have about 15 minutes before he goes into full cardiac arrest." James watched her move, shocked at how quick and precise she was. "Colonel, how do you know so much about emergency medicine?" "10 years flying rescue missions in combat zones," Kesha replied, adjusting the navigation while also monitoring the captain. "When you're the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and death, you learn fast." Meanwhile, in first class, Richard whispered to anyone who would listen. "She's an imposter. Did you see her clothes? Real professionals don't dress like that. I bet she doesn't even have a pilot's license." His wife, Victoria, who had stayed silent until now, finally spoke. "Richard, stop. You're being ridiculous." "Ridiculous?" Richard snapped back. "I'm trying to save our lives. I won't let our safety rest in the hands of someone who clearly—" He stopped when Kesha's voice came calmly over the intercom, now in full command of the aircraft. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Colonel Washington speaking." Kesha's calm voice came over the intercom. "I will be taking command of this aircraft until we reach our destination. Please remain calm and follow all instructions from the crew." Her voice carried authority, the kind that came from experience, not from trying to impress. Even Richard felt a chill run down his spine. Inside the cockpit, Kesha quickly turned James Wilson from a frozen co-pilot into a useful partner. "James, watch our fuel and pressurization systems. I'm going to get us out of this storm, but I need updates every 30 seconds. "Yes, ma'am," James answered, his confidence returning for the first time since the emergency began. Something about Kesha made him believe survival was possible. Then Kesha did something unexpected. Instead of following the standard escape routes, she began calculating a flight path straight through the storm. James stared at her in shock. "Colonel, with all respect, that breaks every safety rule," he said, watching her scribble numbers on a notepad. For the first time since taking command, Kesha smiled. "James, let me tell you something. In 2018, I was leading a rescue mission in Afghanistan when missiles hit our aircraft. 2 engines failed. The navigation system was gone, and a sandstorm made it impossible to see." She spoke as she flew, her hands moving smoothly over the controls. The manual said to eject and abandon the mission, but 17 wounded soldiers were depending on us. So I ignored the manual, trusted my training, and flew them home. Every single one survived. Her words carried a heavy truth. James realized he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. "Sometimes, James," she continued, "following the rules kills people. But knowing the rules so well that you can break them at the right time, that's what saves lives." At that moment, the cockpit doors swung open. Richard Blackwood had convinced a flight attendant to let him in, claiming he could help. He looked at Kesha's calculations and shouted, "This is madness! You're putting us all in danger. I demand to speak to air traffic control right now," Richard shouted. Kesha didn't even look at him. "Mr. Blackwood, this cockpit is no place for tourists. Please go back to your seat." "Tourist?" Richard's voice cracked. "I've flown in more private jets than you can imagine. I know aviation, and what you're doing is suicide." At that moment, someone else stepped forward. Dr. Patricia Chun, chief of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital, rose from first class and walked calmly to the cockpit. "Colonel Washington," she said, "I'm Dr. Chun, a neurosurgeon. I spent 3 years in military hospitals treating pilots with brain injuries. I can help with Captain Mitchell." Kesha finally turned toward her. The 2 women didn't know each other, but they instantly recognized the same thing. Professionals who had spent their lives saving others under extreme pressure. "Doctor, it would be an honor to have you here," Kesha said. "The captain is stable for now, but we need constant monitoring." Richard's frustration grew. "You're all insane. This is a conspiracy to kill us." Dr. Chun looked at him with calm patience, the kind she used with panicked families in hospitals. "Mr. Blackwood, I've treated hundreds of military pilots. This woman has training money can't buy. I suggest you trust her." "Trust?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Based on what, her word?" Then Kesha did something that silenced the entire plane. Still flying smoothly, she gave an order. "James, tune the radio to military emergency frequency, 121.5. Identify our position to Andrews Air Force Base. Colonel Washington to Andrews Base, requesting identity confirmation for civil emergency," she said into the radio. The reply came instantly. "Colonel Washington, Spectre? Is that really you? This is Commander Rodriguez, Military Air Traffic Control. We confirm your identity. Spectre, you disappeared from radar 20 minutes ago. The entire Air Force is mobilized looking for you." The cabin went silent. Richard Blackwood turned pale, finally realizing the truth. He had completely misjudged one of the most decorated pilots in American history. "Andrews Air Force Base," Kesha said steadily. "We have both a medical and weather emergency. Captain incapacitated. We're inside a storm system. Requesting nearest airport that can handle a Boeing 747 for emergency landing." "Spectre, you have top priority," Commander Rodriguez replied. "All airspace on the East Coast has been cleared for you. Emergency medical equipment is waiting at Baltimore International Airport." Dr. Chun gave a small smile as she noticed Richard's pale face. "Do you know many tourists, Mr. Blackwood, who have the entire Air Force mobilized to help them?" But the crisis was far from over. In the coming minutes, Kesha Washington would need not only her piloting skills, but also knowledge from secret missions that even her superiors didn't fully know. And Richard Blackwood would soon learn he had underestimated not just a pilot, but a living legend of American aviation. "Spectre, we have critical information," Commander Rodriguez said over the radio. "The storm is getting worse. Winds at 180 km/h, hail the size of baseballs. All airports in the region are closed. You are the only aircraft still in the air. The truth hit Richard like a punch. This wasn't just a broken flight. They were flying through a weather disaster so powerful, it had shut down the entire East Coast sky. Kesha's voice was calm. James, I'll need you to monitor vertical speed. We're going to attempt something never tried in a Boeing 747. Her hands moved across the controls as if the aircraft were part of her body. Colonel, what are we doing? James asked nervously, watching readings that suggested maneuvers no passenger plane had ever done. Controlled spiral descent through the eye of the storm, Kesha replied, already doing calculations that stunned both James and Dr. Chun. It was a technique designed for fighter jets, never for a plane this size. Richard felt his legs weaken. In all his business career he had met powerful people, but no one operating at such a level of skill it seemed almost beyond human. Then another voice came over the radio. Spectre, this is General Patricia Hayes, Pentagon Air Operations Command. We confirm your record. Operation Tempest Shield 2019. Is it true you guided a failing C-130 through a sandstorm using only radio communication? Affirmative, General. Similar situation, different conditions, Kesha replied as she adjusted the controls. The huge Boeing 747 twisted through violent air currents that should have torn it apart. James stared in disbelief. Colonel, you saved planes just by giving instructions over the radio? 17 aircraft during my career, Kesha confirmed, her focus steady. When you learn to see weather patterns in 3 dimensions, you can guide any plane, even without being at the controls. Richard felt a crushing realization hit him. The woman he had judged by her looks was not just a skilled pilot. She was a legend of military aviation, studied by enemies around the world. Dr. Chun, Kesha said, I need you to watch Captain Mitchell closely. The next maneuvers will put heavy G-forces on his body. Understood, Dr. Chun replied. He's stable, but you're right about the risk. Kesha spoke into the radio. General Hayes, confirmed that all civilian aircraft are being directed to other airports. I don't want anyone trying to follow our path. Spectre, you're the only aircraft in American airspace right now, the general replied. 13 military bases are monitoring you. The president has been personally briefed. Richard felt dizzy. The president of the United States was being updated about the very flight he was on, piloted by the woman he had insulted because of prejudice. James, take over communications, Kesha ordered. I need full concentration for the descent. At last, Richard spoke again, his voice weak. Colonel Washington, I need to apologize. What I said was… Mr. Blackwood, Kesha interrupted firmly, eyes fixed on the storm. Your apology can wait. Right now, I need to save your life and everyone else's. Then the 747 began a spiral descent that seemed impossible for a plane that size. Kesha had found a vertical air current in the eye of the storm, a hidden tunnel of relative calm. By guiding the aircraft into it, she created a controlled descent below the worst turbulence. My God, James whispered, staring at the instruments. How did you know that current even existed? 10 years flying through hostile weather in the Middle East, Kesha replied. Sandstorms, man-made hurricanes from explosions. Conditions that don't exist in civilian manuals. When you survive the impossible many times, the extraordinary becomes routine. Spectre, this is Commander Rodriguez, came the radio voice. We see your path on radar. This is impossible. How are you keeping a plane this size stable while dropping 4,000 feet per minute? Applied physics, Commander, Kesha answered calmly, and 17 years of turning impossible situations into safe landings. Richard stared out the window as they dropped through the storm's eye. Lightning lit up the clouds like the end of the world, but the plane stayed steady, almost unreal, as if guided by invisible hands. General Hayes, Kesha radioed, requesting coordinates for Dover Air Force Base. We need a runway ready with full emergency support. Spectre, Dover is prepared, came the reply. Main runway cleared, emergency foam applied, ambulances waiting. You have absolute priority. James, Kesha said with a faint smile, when we land, You'll understand why they call me Spectre." Over the next 15 minutes, Richard Blackwood witnessed skill and courage beyond anything he had ever imagined. When the Boeing 747 finally touched down, he understood. Kesha Washington was not only one of the greatest pilots in U.S. military history, but also a woman whose life story turned every insult he had spoken into bitter irony. What no one on board knew yet was that this landing would change more than lives. It would change aviation rules, emergency procedures, and the world's idea of what true competence and courage look like, especially when underestimated by people who confuse privilege with ability. 6 months later, at a Pentagon ceremony, Kesha Washington was promoted to Brigadier General, the youngest black woman in history to earn that rank. Her storm navigation method was added to military manuals worldwide, and 3 universities created programs in her honor. General Washington saved not only 312 lives that day, the Secretary of Defense said at the ceremony. She changed how we judge competence versus appearance in our armed forces. In the audience, Dr. Patricia Chun clapped proudly. She had written an article with Kesha on emergency aviation medicine that was published in one of the world's top medical journals. James Wilson, now promoted to captain of his own airline, always said Kesha was his greatest inspiration. Meanwhile, Richard Blackwood faced the results of his prejudice. A video of his arrogant comments during the flight had leaked online and gone viral with over 50 million views. His investment company lost 80% of its clients in 3 months, and he went bankrupt. "Daddy, why do people get mad when they see your name on Google?" his 12-year-old daughter asked, shattering what was left of his pride. Victoria filed for divorce, taking half his assets and full custody of the children. "I married a man who admired success," she told the judge, "but I lived 15 years with someone who confused privilege with competence." Richard now worked as a salesman at a used car dealership, riding public transport, the same ordinary life he had once despised. Every morning he passed a billboard showing Kesha in uniform with the words, "Leadership has no color. It has character." At the Air Force Academy, a cadet once asked Kesha how to deal with prejudice. She answered, "Let them underestimate you. While they waste energy doubting you, use that same energy to grow skills they can never deny." Kesha's story went on to inspire a whole new generation of young military officers from minority backgrounds. Kesha's book, Flying Through the Storms, became a bestseller, with all profits going to aviation scholarships. 3 years later, Richard saw her at an airport. She wore a general's uniform, surrounded by aides and security. He wore a blue car dealership uniform, holding a cheap suitcase. "General Washington," he said softly, "I would like to properly apologize for what happened on that flight." Kesha looked at him carefully. She no longer saw the arrogant man from before, but someone broken by his own mistakes. "Mr. Blackwood, you gave me the greatest gift that day." "How so?" Richard asked. "You reminded me why I do what I do. Every life I save, every pilot I train, every barrier I break. It's possible because people like you exist to motivate me to prove them wrong." Richard swallowed hard. "I lost everything because of my prejudice." "No, sir," Kesha said gently. "You discovered you never had anything real to lose. Privilege is not achievement. Respect is not inheritance. Competence is not appearance." As she walked away with her team, Richard understood the hardest lesson of his life. The woman he once thought unqualified now commanded entire squadrons, while he could hardly manage his own life. Kesha's greatest revenge was not destroying Richard Blackwood. It was building a legacy so powerful that his prejudice no longer mattered. She showed that true success is not only the best revenge, it is the only revenge worth having. In her last interview, she summed it up. "While they waste time underestimating us, we spend that time becoming unforgettable."